February 20th, 1943, north of Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The desert was still cold from the night, but the air already shimmered with dust kicked up by advancing tanks. German Panzer IV commanders peered through their periscopes, expecting to see the familiar chaos of American armor, slow, clumsy, and easily confused under fire. Instead, what they witnessed that morning defied every page of Wehrmacht doctrine. Through the smoke and haze, 5 Sherman tanks advanced across broken ground. There was no line of sight between them. Rocky ridges and scrubby gullies cut them off from one another, yet somehow, impossibly, they moved in perfect unison. One tank swung left, the other right. Another covered the open ground while the 4th and 5th slipped into firing positions, as if guided by an invisible hand. Each crew seemed to know exactly where their comrades were, without flags, without flares, without dispatch riders shouting orders. To the Germans watching, it looked supernatural. Inside their own Panzer IVs, the story was very different. The crews strained to hear orders over the static-filled buzz of their Fug 5 radios. The signals faded in and out, crackling under the roar of Maybach engines and the grinding of treads. At times, it was impossible to tell whether a message was coming from their company commander or just interference from the electrical noise inside their own machines. For the majority of German tanks, communication wasn't even possible. Only a few vehicles in each platoon had full transmitters. The rest carried receivers only, able to listen but not to speak. A tank might spot an enemy ambush, but it couldn't warn the others. If the commander's vehicle was knocked out, the entire unit went silent, each crew left to guess what the next move should be. The Americans, it seemed, were playing a different game entirely. Every Sherman in that formation carried something new, something the Germans didn't even know existed. Beneath layers of steel and oil and dust, hidden among spare shells and ration tins, sat a compact metal box weighing 180 pounds. It was called the SCR-508. Unlike the German radios, it didn't rely on the old, fragile method of amplitude modulation, the same kind of technology that made civilian radios hiss and pop whenever a lightning storm rolled across the sky. No. These American sets used something else, something that seemed almost magical to the men of 1943. Frequency modulation. The result was staggering. Clear, sharp voices cut through the noise of engines, the hammering of machine guns, even the concussion of artillery. Orders were heard, acknowledged, and executed instantly. For the first time in armored warfare, a platoon of tanks could fight as if they were parts of a single organism, eyes, ears, and steel fists, all guided by one brain. On that morning outside Kasserine, the Germans learned this the hard way. Panzer gunners adjusted their sights, expecting to pick off the Shermans one by one. Instead, the American tanks overlapped their fields of fire, covering each other's blind spots. When one came under attack, the others shifted automatically to suppress the German position. There were no pauses, no visible signals, just fluid movement. One German officer, years later, described it with a shiver in his voice. They moved as if they had telepathy. We could not understand it. We thought perhaps they had drilled together for months. Only later did we realize it was the radios. That morning ended in confusion for both sides. The Germans, hardened veterans of North Africa, still carried the day tactically. American formations were pushed back in places, and Kasserine itself would become a painful defeat for the inexperienced U.S. Army. But among German officers and intelligence units, a far more disturbing note entered their reports. Every American tank appeared capable of transmitting as well as receiving. Their communication is exceptionally clear, free of static, and maintained at ranges where our sets provide only noise. They maneuver in ways we had believed impossible, without visual contact. It was the beginning of a realization that would haunt German tank crews from Tunisia to Normandy. The Americans had mastered an invisible weapon, not a thicker gun barrel, not more armor, but something far more decisive. They had mastered the airwaves. And while it looked like magic to the men who faced it, this new battlefield network had its origins not in the sands of Tunisia, but in the laboratories and factories of the United States, thousands of miles away. Because long before the Shermans rolled into Africa, American engineers had quietly solved a problem that Germany didn't even realize it had. And when German officers first heard those crisp American tank transmissions in North Africa, they assumed it must be some exotic secret device smuggled in from Britain, or perhaps a captured civilian technology pressed into service. The truth was stranger. The invisible network binding Sherman tanks together had been born not in the smoke of battle, but in the quiet halls of American laboratories and factories years earlier. At the heart of this revolution was a man named Edwin Howard Armstrong, a brilliant, eccentric inventor from New York, whose restless mind had already changed the way the world communicated. Armstrong had created the super-heterodyne receiver during World War I, making radios practical for military use. But in the 1930s, he grew frustrated with the constant static and distortion of amplitude modulation, AM, the same problem that plagued German Fuge 5 tank radios in Africa. Armstrong's solution was frequency modulation, or FM. Instead of varying the strength of a radio wave like AM, FM varied its frequency. The result was stunningly clear sound that cut through electrical interference. To a German tanker, it looked like magic. To Armstrong, it was pure engineering. But great inventions don't win wars on their own. They require institutions, money, and above all, vision. That vision came from the United States Army Signal Corps and a company that would soon become a household name, Motorola. Back then, it was called Galvin Manufacturing. Founded in Chicago in the late 1920s by brothers Paul and Joseph Galvin, the company had pioneered car radios, putting affordable communication in automobiles. When war loomed, the Army came knocking, asking if Galvin's engineers could adapt Armstrong's FM technology for armored vehicles. Two men at Motorola would rise to the challenge. The first was Daniel E. Noble, a professor of engineering from Connecticut, who saw immediately how FM could transform the battlefield. He became the evangelist, the man who convinced skeptical Army brass that FM wasn't a risky gimmick but the future of military communication. The second was Henryk Magnuski, a Polish-born radio engineer who had fled Europe just in time. Magnuski was the hands-on genius, the man who figured out how to make FM sets rugged enough to survive inside a tank, machines that shook, overheated, and rattled like iron cages on tracks. Together with a small team at Motorola, Noble and Magnuski designed the SCR-508, the radio set that would make Sherman tanks something greater than steel boxes with guns. It wasn't easy. Radios of the 1930s were fragile things, filled with vacuum tubes that broke under vibration and circuits that shorted when exposed to heat and dust. Tank interiors were brutal places, cramped, deafening, and constantly shaking. Installing delicate electronics inside them seemed like lunacy. Magnuski tackled each challenge like a craftsman. He built shock mounts to absorb the pounding of rough terrain. He perfected cooling systems to keep the set stable inside sweltering desert heat. He tested frequency crystals until they held steady even as engines roared at full throttle. By the summer of 1941, the Army had seen enough. On July 22nd, it issued an order that would quietly change the war. Every medium tank produced in the United States would carry the new SCR-508 or its variants. No exceptions. The transformation had begun. Now, every Sherman tank would be a node in what was, in effect, the world's first battlefield communication network. With its 25-watt transmitter, 2.5 times more powerful than the German Fuge 5, and its crystal-controlled channels, the Sherman's radio was more than just a tool. It was a weapon. The timing couldn't have been more critical. In the summer of 1941, as German panzers rolled deep into the Soviet Union, slicing through Red Army defenses with ruthless efficiency, America was still officially at peace. But US planners knew the day of entry was coming, and when it did, they wanted American tank crews to have something the Germans didn't expect. What Daniel Noble and Henrik Magnuski built was more than a radio. It was trust, translated into electromagnetic waves. Each tank crew could depend on the others because they could talk, clearly, instantly, without guessing or waiting for signals. In hindsight, it seems obvious. Of course, every tank should have a radio. But in 1941, that was a radical idea. Even the Germans, pioneers of blitzkrieg, only equipped their command tanks with full transceivers. Everyone else followed orders like blind men in formation. The Americans were about to prove that when every tank could command, no formation was ever truly blind. The battlefield would never be the same. And so, when the Shermans rolled off the assembly lines in Detroit and were shipped across the Atlantic, they carried with them something invisible yet decisive. An advantage no German spy plane could photograph, no tank ace could outshoot, and no artillery barrage could destroy. It was an advantage built not on brute force, but on imagination. An advantage born in American classrooms, factories, and laboratories long before a single Sherman fired its first shot in anger. And soon, that invisible advantage would make its presence felt. Because in November 1942, American armor landed in North Africa, and for the first time, the Germans would face not just American tanks, but American tanks that could speak to each other as one. November 8, 1942. The Mediterranean surf pounded against landing craft as dawn broke over the coast of French North Africa. Operation Torch, the first great American offensive of the war, was underway. For most of the German officers watching reports trickle in, the Americans were still an unknown quantity. They knew the British. They had fought them in France, Greece, and across the desert. But the Americans, the propaganda machine in Berlin, painted them as soft, clumsy amateurs, factory workers and farmers dressed up as soldiers. That morning, as American Sherman tanks rumbled ashore near Safi and Fadala, the Germans prepared to test that belief. The Sherman was not an intimidating machine by appearance alone. To German eyes, its 75mm gun was unimpressive compared to the long-barreled cannons on Panzer IVs. Its armor looked average at best. Even its silhouette seemed almost toy-like when set beside the squat, menacing lines of a German tank. But what the Germans couldn't see was what truly mattered. Inside every one of those Shermans was a brand new SCR 508 FM radio set, built in Chicago, shipped across the Atlantic, and installed in Detroit's production lines by the thousands. For the first time in the history of armored warfare, every single tank in an army could talk, and talk clearly. On paper, the Germans had a head start in tank radios. Heinz Guderian himself, the architect of Blitzkrieg, had insisted that German panzers carry radios back in the 1930s, when no other army bothered. It was one of the reasons why German spearheads had cut through France so easily in 1940. But by late 1942, their technology was already showing its age. The Fug 5, the standard German tank radio, used amplitude modulation. It was good enough in the calm of pre-war exercises. But on the battlefield it was another story. Every engine spark, every electric motor, every scrape of metal on metal sent bursts of static through the headphones. The 10-watt transmitters could barely reach a few hundred yards if the tanks were moving. And worst of all, most tanks didn't even have transmitters. In a German platoon of 5 tanks, only 1 or 2 could send messages. The others could only receive, and only when interference didn't drown out the signal. Orders traveled one way, top down. If the lead tank was destroyed, the rest were often leaderless, unable to coordinate except through hand signals or desperate guesswork. By contrast, the Shermans landing that day in North Africa were like an orchestra tuning up before a concert. Every tank crew could hear the others. Every tank commander could send a warning or request support. If one vehicle was knocked out, another could instantly step in as the new leader. This wasn't just an improvement, it was a revolution. as the landings turned into pitched battles against Vichy French defenders and soon against the hardened veterans of the Africa Corps. American tank crews discovered what their new radios could do. Picture it. Dust storms rising over rocky plains, Sherman engines roaring, German 88s cracking like thunder in the distance. Amid that chaos, American tank commanders sat with headsets pressed against their ears, listening to clear, sharp voices. 2 enemy tanks on the ridge, moving left. Roger. Covering your advance. Fire on my mark. Copy. Advancing now. For the first time, armored warfare wasn't a series of isolated duels between individual tanks. It was a coordinated dance, a networked assault where every crew was part of something larger. The Germans noticed quickly. Signals intelligence units intercepted American transmissions and were astonished. Reports described the clarity of the voices, the speed of the coordination, the way American units seemed to maneuver without hesitation, even when scattered over miles of terrain. One German officer would later remark, "We could not understand how they maintained such cohesion. Our tanks were bound to their leaders like children to parents. The Americans moved as if each one was its own commander." Of course, Operation Torch wasn't a flawless victory. American forces were green, untested in large-scale combat. They struggled against Rommel's battle-hardened troops in the months that followed, especially at Kasserine Pass. Tanks were lost, units were mauled, mistakes were paid for in blood. But beneath the setbacks, something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, the Germans were facing an opponent whose tanks did not operate in silence. And that invisible advantage, the ability of every Sherman to speak, was about to grow more dangerous with each passing month. Because as the campaign moved from the beaches of Morocco to the mountains of Tunisia, the Germans would learn that American coordination, powered by FM radios, could turn even defeat into revelation. And soon, at Kasserine, they would see just how unnerving this invisible weapon could be. February 14th, 1943. The mountains and valleys of Tunisia echoed with the thunder of battle. Here, at the narrow defile known as Kasserine Pass, the inexperienced U.S. Army was about to meet one of the Wehrmacht's most seasoned commanders, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself. The setting could not have been more brutal. The pass was a natural choke point, rocky cliffs hemming in the valley floor. For Rommel, it was the perfect place to spring a trap. For the Americans, it was their baptism by fire. And fire it was. At dawn, German panzer divisions struck with precision. Tanks advanced under the cover of artillery, while Luftwaffe dive bombers screamed overhead. American units, many still learning how to fight together, faltered under the pressure. Lines broke, equipment was abandoned, entire companies scattered in confusion. To German eyes, the battle was unfolding exactly as expected. Here were the amateurs, the cowboys Berlin propaganda had mocked. They retreated in disarray, leaving behind burning tanks and overturned trucks. But in the midst of this apparent collapse, something caught German attention. The Americans weren't completely blind. Even as units broke apart, scattered Shermans kept moving as if tied together by invisible strings. Crews who had never trained side by side still managed to coordinate flanking moves. Isolated tank groups warned one another of ambushes miles away. Artillery strikes were called in with uncanny accuracy, landing within minutes on targets spotted by forward elements. German signals intelligence soon discovered why. They intercepted American tank transmissions, clear, calm, and shockingly precise. Where German Fuji 5 radios could barely cut through their own static, the American SCR 508s carried voices that sounded as if the speaker was standing in the next room. Orders weren't shouted over interference. They were crisp, understood, and acted upon instantly. Reports from the German 10th Panzer Division described what they saw with disbelief. American units maintain communication across distances that render our radios useless. Even small elements, when separated, act as if still connected to their commanders. It didn't stop the Germans from winning the day. Rommel's veterans drove the Americans back, capturing supplies and forcing the Allies to regroup. The casualty lists were long. The headlines in Berlin trumpeted another German victory. Yet among the Wehrmacht's senior staff, the mood was less triumphant. Something about this battle was unsettling. Yes, the Americans had been beaten. But they had shown a capability the Germans had not prepared for, a kind of battlefield cohesion that should have been impossible for a force so green, so inexperienced. One German officer, years later, admitted what many thought but didn't dare say at the time. At Kasserine, we saw the shadow of the future. They lost the battle, but they fought as though connected by wires we could not cut. For the Americans, Kasserine was a painful teacher. The defeat exposed flaws in leadership, tactics, and training. General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself admitted that the U.S. Army had much to learn before it could stand toe-to-toe with the Germans. And learn they did, swiftly. But the one thing that needed no lesson was the radios. Those had already proven themselves beyond doubt. Even in disaster, they gave scattered units the ability to fight as a whole. Imagine being a young American tanker in that chaos. Smoke clogging the sky, shells hammering the earth, German armor pressing hard. Alone, you'd have felt doomed, but with the headset snug over your ears, a voice cut through the madness. Hold position. Support is on the way. Enemy on your left. I've got you covered. That voice was more than communication. It was hope. It was proof that you weren't fighting alone. The Germans didn't understand it yet, but that invisible lifeline, those FM radio waves, were quietly laying the foundation for what would come. Because while Kasserine Pass was marked in history as an American defeat, it was also the moment when the Wehrmacht first realized it was no longer the only army in the world that understood the power of communication. And unlike Germany, the United States had the industrial capacity to put a radio in every single tank, every single vehicle, if needed. The Desert Fox had won his last great victory in North Africa, but the invisible advantage of the Shermans meant his days of exploiting confusion on the battlefield were numbered. The Americans had taken their beating, but they had also shown a glimpse of what was to come, an army that would move not as a mob, but as a network. And soon, in the mountains of Italy, the Germans would learn that not even the terrain itself could stop these American voices from carrying across the battlefield. By early 1943, the lessons of Kasserine Pass were etched into the minds of both armies. For the Germans, it was confirmation that Americans were inexperienced. For the Americans, it was a hard-earned education in combat. But underneath those headlines, something deeper was at play, something invisible yet critical. It wasn't about who had the longer gun barrel or the thicker armor. It was about who could talk, who could coordinate, who could turn a group of machines into a single deadly instrument. And in that contest, the Americans were light years ahead. Let's compare the tools of the trade. The standard German tank radio in World War II was the Funkgerät 5 or Fuji 5. When it was first introduced in the mid-1930s, it was considered cutting edge. At that time, no other nation had bothered to equip most of its tanks with radios at all. The Fug 5 gave German panzers the ability to coordinate during the Blitzkrieg campaigns in Poland and France. But by 1942 to 43, its limitations were glaring. Power output. Just 10 watts. That meant a practical range of 1 to 2 miles at best, and often far less when the tank was moving. Technology. It used amplitude modulation, AM. That was fine on a quiet test range, but on a battlefield, it was a disaster. Every spark plug, every engine ignition, every grinding tread produced interference. What the crew heard was mostly static, with the commander's voice buried somewhere underneath. One-way communication. In most German platoons, only the leader's tank had a full transceiver that could both send and receive. The rest had simple receivers only. They could hear, but they could not reply. If that lead tank was destroyed, as they often were, the whole platoon fell into silence. Frequency range. Operating between 27 and 33 megahertz, the Fuji 5 was prone to overlapping civilian interference and was limited in adaptability. In short, it was a 1930s radio fighting a 1940s war. Now compare that to the SCR 508, the Sherman's standard radio. Power output, 25 watts, more than twice the German Fuji 5, giving a practical range of up to 5 miles, even with tanks on the move. Technology. It used frequency modulation, FM. Instead of amplifying background noise, FM filtered it out. That meant clear, sharp communication, even in the middle of a battlefield full of artillery blasts and engine roars. Two-way communication. Every single Sherman carried a full transmitter and receiver. That meant every tank could speak, not just listen. If a commander went down, another tank instantly filled the role. Crystal control. The radios used crystal control channels for stability. No drifting signals, no fading in and out. A commander could switch to one of 10 preset channels instantly, coordinating with artillery, infantry, or other units. Frequency range, operating between 20 and 27 megahertz. The SCR 508 had a wide band that gave American tankers flexibility across different battlefields. The difference was not small, it was revolutionary. Think of it this way. German tank units were like a chain, strong so long as the leader remained intact. But cut that chain, destroy the lead tank, and the rest were blind, unable to communicate, unable to adapt. American units, on the other hand, were like a web. Knock out one Sherman, and the others still talked freely, still maneuvered, still fought as a coordinated team. The Germans had built their doctrine around centralized control. The Americans had unknowingly stumbled into something far more modern. Decentralized command powered by universal communication. It was the difference between a group of tanks acting as individuals and a platoon of Shermans acting as one machine. Captured German reports from 1943 reveal the shock. American armored units show unusual ability to coordinate without visual signals. They maneuver with a fluidity that cannot be explained by existing doctrine. Another intelligence summary noted bitterly, "Our radios are often unusable in combat. Theirs are never silent." The irony was sharp. Germany had pioneered tank radios back in the 1920s, when most nations laughed at the idea. Heinz Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg, had insisted that radios were the nervous system of armored warfare. And yet, by 1943, it was the Americans, not the Germans, who had made that dream a reality. For the soldiers inside those Shermans, the difference was life itself. Imagine sitting in the gunner's seat, heart pounding, sweat dripping despite the cold desert night. Without radios, you'd fight in isolation, waiting for a flare, trying to interpret hand signals, hoping your commander knew what was happening beyond your tiny field of vision. With the SCR 508, it was different. A calm voice came through your headset. "Target left. Fire now. Enemy flank exposed. Advance." Those words turned chaos into control. And that control turned defeat into survival. In hindsight, the contrast between the FUG 5 and the SCR 508 wasn't just a technical difference. It was a preview of the future of war. The Germans clung to centralized systems, brittle and vulnerable. The Americans embraced a network, flexible and resilient. That invisible network would only grow stronger as the war moved forward. In the mountains of Italy, across the beaches of Normandy, and into the hedgerows of France, the Sherman's radios would prove over and over again that the most powerful weapon is not always the one you can see, because sometimes victory begins with a voice in your ear. September 1943. The Allies had invaded the Italian mainland, driving north against some of the toughest terrain in Europe. Gone were the wide, open spaces of North Africa. In their place rose mountains, ravines, and narrow valleys that twisted like a maze. For tankers, it was a nightmare. Mountains do strange things to radio waves. They block signals, scatter them, bounce them back in jagged echoes. A weak radio set becomes nearly useless when a granite ridge stands in the way. Communication fails. Orders vanish into static. Units become isolated pockets of steel, each one fighting its own private war. For the Germans, this was exactly what happened. Their FUG-5 radios, already plagued by static in the open desert, now struggled even more. A tank commander might call to a vehicle just a few hundred yards away, only to get nothing but silence. Whole units had to rely on runners again, sending men sprinting between tanks with shouted orders scribbled on scraps of paper. It was blitzkrieg dragged backward into the mud of the First World War. But for the Americans, the story was different. The Sherman's SCR-508, with its FM technology, proved astonishingly resilient in Italy's hills. The frequency modulation cut through interference, while the stronger 25-watt output carried over ridges that should have silenced weaker sets. Time and again, German troops were caught off guard when American units maneuvered as if the mountains weren't there at all. One German report from the Gustav Line put it bluntly: enemy armor coordinates as if fighting on flat ground. Terrain does not hinder their communication. This is impossible with our equipment. Consider the scene. A Sherman platoon winding its way up a valley road near Monte Cassino. German artillery has bracketed the pass, and panzer grenadiers lurk with panzerfausts among the rocks. By rights, the Americans should have been walking blind into a slaughter. The lead tank rounds a bend, spots an enemy position, and instantly transmits: ambush left, 200 yards. Take cover. Within seconds, every Sherman in the column reacts. One lays down suppressive fire, another backs into a defilade. Infantry riding on the tanks scatter to cover, already warned. Artillery is called in over another channel, coordinates rattled off with deadly precision. The ambush collapses before it begins. From the German side, it was incomprehensible. How could tanks out of sight of one another act in such harmony? How could they coordinate faster than hand signals or flares? To men raised on the brittle chains of the FUG-5, it looked like Americans had discovered a new kind of sixth sense. In truth, it was just the headset and the microphone, the invisible gift of FM. But the radios did more than win skirmishes. They shaped entire campaigns. At Salerno, when the landing nearly collapsed under counterattack, Sherman radios kept American armor and infantry linked in the chaos. At Anzio, where every movement was under German artillery fire, the ability to coordinate instantly saved lives and held the beachhead when it seemed doomed. Even the brutal Battle of Monte Cassino bore witness. Amid rubble and smoke, Shermans and infantry worked together with a fluidity the Germans couldn't match, guiding fire, shifting positions, never fully losing contact despite the broken terrain. A veteran of the 1st Armored Division later recalled, "The only thing that kept us from being picked apart was those radios. Without them, we'd have been no better than the French in '40. For the German command, frustration mounted. Their doctrine had been built on speed and coordination, but now they were the ones lagging behind, slowed by silence. Time after time, Allied breakthroughs came, not because the Sherman was stronger. It wasn't, but because it was smarter. It could fight as part of a living network, while German tanks fought as lonely, isolated machines. And as the campaign ground its way north through Italy's mountains, a realization spread among German tankers. The Americans didn't just bring more machines. They brought something far more dangerous, machines that could think together. By late 1943, Rommel himself admitted privately that the Americans had closed the gap. The desert advantage the Germans once held was gone. Now it was the Wehrmacht fighting at a disadvantage, deaf in the mountains while the enemy spoke freely. The battlefield had shifted. The tide of technology was turning, and as the Shermans rolled north through Italy, their radios crackling with clear voices, a far greater test was approaching. Across the Channel, preparations were already underway for the largest amphibious invasion in history. When the Shermans landed in Normandy, those radios would do more than guide tanks. They would connect armor to infantry, to artillery, and even to the guns of the mighty Allied fleet offshore. The invisible weapon was about to show its full power. June 6, 1944. The dawn sky over Normandy burned with tracer fire, explosions, and smoke. The largest amphibious invasion in history was underway. For the soldiers spilling out of landing craft, it was chaos. Sand whipped by bullets, barbed wire, mines, and the thunder of German artillery from the bluffs above. The beach was death itself. And yet, amid the madness, something held the invasion together. It wasn't just courage, or numbers, or steel. It was communication. Inside the first Sherman tanks to reach shore, tank commanders adjusted the dials on their SCR 508 FM radios and began calling not only to their fellow tanks, but to the infantry beside them, the artillery behind them, and even the naval guns waiting offshore. The radios turned isolated men and machines into one connected force. Picture it. A Sherman struggles off a landing craft, water rising nearly to its turret as it claws up the beach. Machine gun fire rattles against its armor. The tank commander flips open his microphone and shouts into the net, "Target, bunker at the tree line, sector green 2. That call doesn't vanish into static, as it would have on a German Fug 5. Instead, it is heard instantly. By another Sherman, by artillery observers on the sand, and by a naval spotter crouched behind a dune with a direct line to a battleship offshore. Within moments, the sky cracks open. A 14-inch shell from the USS Texas screams overhead and smashes into the German bunker. The infantry surges forward under the cover. Shermans follow, and the beachhead begins to expand. This wasn't luck. It was the invisible nervous system of the invasion. The radios. The Normandy landings were not just an amphibious assault. They were the most complex, coordinated attack ever attempted up to that point. 5,000 ships across the channel, 11,000 aircraft overhead, 156,000 men storming 5 beaches. If any part of that machine failed to coordinate, the invasion could collapse. But because every Sherman tank was equipped with FM radios, the American armor arriving on Omaha and Utah beaches could connect directly with supporting fire. They didn't need runners, flares, or desperate guesses. They could speak and be heard. The Germans were stunned. At Omaha Beach, panzer units waited inland for the moment to counterattack. But before they could move, American tanks on the beach were already calling in naval artillery strikes to block the roads. German commanders could barely communicate with their own forward units, while the Americans were tying land, sea, and air together in real time. One German officer captured later admitted, "It seemed as if every American tank was an artillery observer. No matter where we attacked, fire followed instantly." The Germans had prepared the beaches with a hedgehog defense. Bunkers, obstacles, and interlocking fire zones designed to choke an invasion at the water's edge. It might have worked had the attackers been forced to fight blind, as so many armies before had done. But the Americans weren't blind. When infantry was pinned by a machine gun nest, a Sherman commander could relay coordinates. Within minutes, that position was blasted apart, sometimes by a neighboring tank, other times by artillery batteries firing from ships miles away. And as Shermans pushed inland past the beach, their radios tied them to forward observers, linking the grind of armored combat with the thunder of long-range firepower. For German tankers and infantry watching from the high ground, the coordination was bewildering. How could tanks fresh off the boats, scattered across a chaotic battlefield, fight with such precision? How could a unit pinned down in one sector call down destruction within minutes, as if the enemy had eyes everywhere? To the Wehrmacht, it felt less like technology and more like witchcraft. They had no idea that the key was a compact metal box humming quietly inside every Sherman. One stunned prisoner told his interrogators, "We thought you had wires buried in the sand. How else could you talk to ships at sea from inside a tank?" But for the Americans themselves, the radios were more than hardware. They were lifelines. On Omaha Beach, where the first wave suffered terrible losses, Shermans with functioning radios became rallying points. Infantrymen who had lost their officers could cluster around a tank, listening as the commander's calm voice directed them. "Follow us. We're moving up the draw. Artillery's got our flank." Those words, transmitted across sand and blood, gave direction to chaos. They gave hope where there had only been confusion. Looking back, it is no exaggeration to say that without radios, D-Day might have failed. The beaches could have become killing grounds, the landings repelled. But because American tanks carried the invisible gift of FM communication, the Allies had the ability to adapt, to turn scattered landings into a coordinated push inland. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't roar like an engine or boom like a cannon, but it connected men and machines in a way the Germans could not match. And as the Allies pushed off the beaches and into the tangled hedgerows of Normandy, those radios would face their hardest test yet. Because while the Shermans could talk to each other, they soon discovered a deadly gap. Their infantry allies couldn't talk back, and in the Bocage country, that silence could kill. By mid-June 1944, the Allies were off the beaches of Normandy. Victory at D-Day had been secured, but the next challenge was unlike anything American tankers had faced before. It was called the Bocage, a patchwork of fields enclosed by centuries-old hedgerows, thick earthen banks crowned with tangled roots, bushes and trees. For infantry, the Bocage was suffocating. Every field was a trap. Every corner concealed a sniper or machine gun. For tanks, it was worse. Visibility shrank to a few dozen yards. The wide-open maneuvers of North Africa were impossible. In Normandy, war was fought field by field, hedge by hedge, in a bloody crawl. And here the Sherman's greatest strength, its radios, revealed a dangerous weakness. The Sherman crews could talk clearly to one another. Platoon leaders could call for artillery or coordinate flanking maneuvers, but the men they needed most, the infantry walking alongside them, were silent. Infantry squads carried only handheld radios, often unreliable and operating on entirely different frequencies. Most had nothing at all. To warn a Sherman about an enemy ahead, a soldier had to bang on the armor with his rifle butt or shout through the noise. Sometimes they'd climb onto the back of the tank, trying to yell into the commander's open hatch, an act that often drew enemy fire. In the confusion of bocage fighting, that silence was deadly. The Germans knew how to exploit it. Hidden in the hedgerows, Panzerfaust teams waited like hunters in tall grass. The American infantry could see them, but too often they couldn't warn the tanks in time. Again and again, Shermans rumbled forward alone, blind, their crews unaware of the ambush just beyond the hedge. A single Panzerfaust rocket, fired at close range, could turn a tank into a funeral pyre. One veteran of the 29th Infantry Division recalled bitterly, "We'd scream, we'd throw rocks, anything to get their attention. Half the time, it was too late. The Krauts would hit them before they even knew they were in danger." The radios that had made Shermans so effective against German armor suddenly meant little in the claustrophobic hell of Normandy's hedgerows. The tanks could speak to each other, but not to the men who kept them alive in close combat. The result was grim. In June and July 1944 alone, hundreds of Shermans were knocked out by German infantry armed with Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks. Crews spoke of the terrifying moments when a warning cry reached them only after the rocket struck. One Sherman gunner described it. "You hear the bang on the back plate, someone trying to warn you. Then you hear the whoosh of a Panzerfaust. If you're lucky, it hits the track. If you're not, it's the turret, and that's the end of it." The lack of communication didn't just cost lives, it bred resentment. Infantrymen accused tankers of charging ahead recklessly. Tankers accused infantry of hanging back and leaving them exposed. Both were partly right. But at the heart of the problem was silence. Without a way to share what they saw, the two arms of the American force often fought as strangers, even when they were only feet apart. The irony was bitter. American technology had given Shermans an invisible voice that reached miles across the battlefield, but not a few yards to the men in the hedgerows. Officers took notice. After-action reports from Normandy repeatedly pointed out the gap. One division summary read, armored units operate effectively among themselves. However, communication with accompanying infantry is almost non-existent, resulting in unnecessary losses. Something had to change, and fast. The solution wouldn't come from generals or engineers in far-off laboratories. It would come from the field itself, from soldiers desperate to survive. In the hedgerows of Normandy, American GIs would invent a simple, almost crude fix, one that turned the Sherman's radios into a lifeline for the infantry as well. It was a box bolted to the back of the tank, a wire leading inside, and a handset dangling for the infantry to grab. It was the tank telephone, and it would change everything. Normandy, July 1944. The Bocage campaign was grinding on, each mile of French countryside costing blood. American infantry and Sherman crews fought bravely, but again and again, the same deadly problem surfaced. They couldn't talk to each other. Shermans could coordinate with one another beautifully, thanks to their FM radios. But the foot soldiers, the men crawling through ditches, hugging hedgerows and storming farmhouses, had no way to reach those inside the tanks except by shouting, banging, or climbing onto hot steel under fire. The result was predictable. Tanks blundered into ambushes that infantry could see but couldn't warn about. Infantry felt abandoned when tanks pulled back suddenly, unaware of threats ahead. Resentment simmered. Reports piled up. Something had to change. The army didn't have time for a grand new invention. The solution came from the men themselves, gritty, practical, and improvised. Somewhere in Normandy, a GI looked at a spare field telephone, looked at the back of a Sherman, and thought, why not? Crews began welding or bolting small boxes to the rear of their tanks. Inside the box, a field telephone handset wired directly into the Sherman's radio intercom. Infantry advancing behind the tank could run up, grab the handset, and speak directly to the crew inside. The first versions were crude, sometimes just a handset tied to the tank with rope, sometimes jammed inside a ration tin or an ammo box to protect it from mud, but they worked. Now, when an infantryman spotted a Panzerfaust team lurking behind the next hedge, he didn't have to risk his life climbing onto the turret. He could pick up the phone and calmly tell the commander, "Tank busters ahead, 30 yards left." And instantly, the Sherman could react. The idea spread like wildfire. What began as improvisation soon became near standard practice. Units all across Normandy copied it. Engineers refined the design, creating a rugged metal box with a simple handset and push-to-talk button. It was christened the Infantry Tank Telephone. By late 1944, many Shermans rolling off the line in Europe already had factory-made versions of the field innovation. What started as a desperate fix in the hedgerows had become official army equipment. The difference was night and day. At St. Lo, where hedgerows turned into killing zones, the tank telephone saved lives. Infantry pinned down could call for immediate fire support. Sherman gunners no longer wasted precious seconds guessing where to point their 75mm. They received precise instructions from the very men crawling forward under fire. One infantry sergeant remembered with relief. It was the first time we felt like the tanks were ours, not just machines rumbling ahead, but partners who heard us. And for the tankers, the telephone ended the bitterness. No longer were they cursed as reckless or cowardly. Now they fought as part of a team. For the Germans, the innovation was another bitter surprise. Their doctrine assumed tanks and infantry would always struggle to coordinate. Their Panzerfaust ambushes relied on that gap. Suddenly, the gap was closing. Instead of Shermans stumbling forward blind, infantry now guided them hedge by hedge, ambush by ambush. German soldiers who had once picked off isolated tanks found themselves caught in devastating crossfire because the infantry on the ground had a direct line into the steel beasts beside them. The tank telephone wasn't glamorous. It wasn't designed by a famous engineer in a lab or backed by millions in research. It was born in mud, smoke, and desperation. but it embodied what set the American war effort apart: the ability to adapt quickly, to improvise solutions, to listen to the men on the ground. Where the Germans clung to rigid doctrine and outdated equipment, the Americans bent, flexed, and innovated. And in the bocage, that flexibility turned defeat into survival, and survival into victory. The tank telephone was more than a battlefield fix. It was a glimpse of the future of combined arms warfare. No longer would tanks and infantry fight as separate entities. They would be connected by wires, by radios, eventually by digital networks. It was in its own humble way the ancestor of the communication systems that still tie armored vehicles and soldiers together today. And in 1944, in the hedgerows of Normandy, it was the difference between life and death. As summer wore on, the Allies prepared for a massive offensive to break out of Normandy. Operation Cobra would unleash hundreds of Shermans across the French countryside. This time, they would not just talk to one another. They would march in step with the infantry walking in their shadow. The invisible voices inside the Shermans, now joined by the voices of the infantry at their backs, would transform American armored warfare into something the Germans could neither predict nor stop. The Americans had solved the silence, and soon they would turn that newfound coordination into a hammer blow that shattered the German front. July 25, 1944. The sky above Normandy was a wall of thunder. More than 3,000 Allied bombers pounded German defenses west of Saint-Lô, turning hedgerows and villages into smoking craters. It was the opening blow of Operation Cobra, the breakout that would finally free the Allies from the bocage and unleash them across France. For weeks, the Americans had been strangled by the hedgerows, advancing only yards at a time. Now, they planned to smash through in a single, overwhelming strike. And at the heart of that strike were the Shermans, hundreds of them, engines idling, waiting for the dust to clear. When the order came, it wasn't chaos. It wasn't every tank lunging forward blindly. Instead, it was a symphony. Sherman after Sherman rolled out, platoons advancing in staggered formation, every commander's voice alive on the SCR 508 network. Red platoon, move left, cover the ridge. Copy, white platoon advancing center. Artillery standing by. Coordinates locked. What looked to German eyes like a tidal wave of steel was, in fact, a carefully choreographed advance, directed not by hand signals or guesswork, but by a constant stream of calm, clear voices. Each Sherman wasn't just a tank. It was a node in a living network. For the German defenders, battered remnants of Panzer Lehr and exhausted infantry divisions, it was a nightmare. They had prepared to fight American armor the way they always had. Ambushes, scattered resistance, trying to sow confusion and cut off units. But when they fired on one group of Shermans, another immediately shifted to flank them. When an anti-tank gun revealed its position, artillery landed on it within minutes, because a tank crew had already called it in over the net. One German soldier later recalled, "It was like fighting an enemy with a single brain. No matter where we struck, the whole mass reacted instantly." What made Cobra different wasn't just the numbers. It was the coordination. Tanks to tanks. Every Sherman spoke to every other, overlapping fields of fire and adjusting positions without delay. Tanks to infantry. With the new tank telephones, GIs on foot guided the armor hedge by hedge, pointing out threats and directing fire. Tanks to artillery and air. Over preset channels, tank commanders called in fire support from batteries and even close airstrikes. The result was devastating. The hedgerows, which had slowed the Allies for nearly 2 months, suddenly ceased to matter. The Shermans weren't fighting as individuals. They were fighting as one organism. An iron fist guided by a network of voices. By July 27th, the German front had shattered. Panzer Lehr, once the pride of the German armored force in the West, was reduced to wreckage. German infantry units, already mauled by the bombing, collapsed under the weight of coordinated American attacks. The Shermans poured through the gap like water through a broken dam. What had been a bloody stalemate became a flood. And everywhere the Germans looked, the same terrifying pattern emerged. American armor moving with supernatural coordination. To the Wehrmacht, it seemed impossible. How could green troops fight with such unity? How could so many tanks act as one? The answer, of course, was humming quietly inside each Sherman, the radios. For the crews inside the tanks, the radios weren't some abstract advantage. They were the difference between life and death. One Sherman commander later described the feeling. You never felt alone. Even when shells were landing around you, even when smoke covered the field, there was always a voice in your ear telling you what to do next. It gave you courage to keep moving. For the infantry, too, the radios were a lifeline. No longer were they running beside tanks that ignored their cries. With the tank telephones, they could guide the steel beasts step by step, turning confusion into cooperation. After Cobra, German officers wrote grim reports. One concluded, the enemy's tanks function as a single unit, regardless of losses. Their ability to coordinate exceeds our own. Unless countermeasures are found, the situation is hopeless. But there were no countermeasures. The FUG-5 couldn't match the SCR-508. German industry, battered by Allied bombing, couldn't mass-produce a better radio fast enough. The Americans had not only caught up, they had surpassed the very inventors of armored warfare. Operation Cobra did more than break Normandy. It opened the door to the liberation of France. Within weeks, American columns were racing across open country, cutting off retreating German forces and encircling them at the Falaise pocket. The Shermans weren't invincible. They still burned when hit by panthers and tigers. They still lost men every day. But thanks to their radios, they fought as something greater than individual tanks. They fought as a connected army. And that connection turned them into a juggernaut the Germans could not stop. In 1940, the world trembled at the word blitzkrieg. Lightning war. Columns of German panzers cut through Poland and France with shocking speed, not because they were stronger, but because they were connected. Heinz Guderian, the father of modern armored warfare, had insisted that radios were the nervous system of the panzer arm. While other nations laughed at the idea of putting radios in every tank, Germany had done it and conquered half of Europe with the advantage. But by 1944, the tables had turned. The men who once boasted of speaking across the battlefield now fought in static and silence, while their enemies, the Americans, spoke freely through the clear voices of FM radios. After Operation Cobra, the Wehrmacht's armored commanders could no longer deny it. Reports poured in. American tanks coordinate without delay. Even when commanders are lost, their formations continue to operate as if led by one brain. Our units are unable to maintain communication in heavy combat. The enemy does not suffer this. For veterans who had once prided themselves on the superiority of German tactics, the realization was devastating. They had invented the very concept of armored radio communication. Yet now, it was the Americans who had perfected it. Heinz Guderian himself, by 1944, serving as Inspector General of Armored Troops, read these reports with grim recognition. The dream he had once fought for, every tank connected, every unit speaking as one, was alive and well, but not in Germany. It was in the United States, inside the Shermans rolling across France. What had gone wrong? The answers were many. German industry was stretched to the breaking point, its factories hammered by Allied bombers. Their radio sets, designed in the 1930s, had never been fundamentally updated. Vacuum tubes still rattled inside boxes that overheated and failed under strain. Most critically, Germany had never embraced the idea of giving every tank a full transceiver. To them, it seemed wasteful. Better to equip only the leaders with transmitters. That doctrine had worked in 1940, when they were the only army using radios at all. By 1944, it was suicide. The German tank crews felt the failure most keenly. Inside a Panzer IV or Panther, the static was constant. A commander shouting into his microphone often heard nothing back but garbled crackles. Orders were delayed, misunderstood, or lost entirely. One veteran recalled with anger, We were like horses with blinders. You saw only what was in your sights. The Americans moved like a pack of wolves, always in touch. We fought alone. Another described the helplessness when the lead tank was destroyed. The platoon became mute. We could hear, but we could not answer. Each tank was its own island. By contrast, captured reports about the Americans filled them with disbelief. Every Sherman could talk. Every platoon was flexible. Even the infantry had learned to plug into the network with those crude tank telephones. The bitterest truth was this: the Germans had shown the world what radios could do. They had shocked the Allies in 1940 with Blitzkrieg, proving that communication was as deadly a weapon as any cannon. And yet, only a few years later, they were the ones outpaced, trapped by their own rigid thinking, while the Americans, their supposed amateurs, improved the concept and used it against them. As one officer later wrote in despair, "We created Blitzkrieg, the Americans perfected it, and they buried us with it." This failure wasn't just technical, it was strategic. Blitzkrieg depended on speed, on coordination, on the ability to move faster than the enemy could react. Without reliable radios, that doctrine withered. By 1944, German offensives sputtered not just from lack of fuel and tanks, but from lack of communication. Units moved too slowly. Orders arrived too late. Counterattacks collapsed into confusion. Meanwhile, the Americans used their radios not only to coordinate tanks, but to integrate artillery, air power, and infantry into a single war machine. The Wehrmacht had become the very thing they once mocked: blind, deaf, and clumsy. To many German veterans, the radio gap became a symbol of the wider war. In 1939, they had led the world in innovation. By 1944, they were falling behind, unable to keep pace with an enemy whose strength lay not only in numbers, but in ideas. It was more than defeat on the battlefield. It was humiliation, a reminder that the edge they once held, the secret that had given them lightning war, now belonged to the enemy. As the Allies surged eastward, German tankers fought on bravely, often outgunning the Shermans in duels, but always outmaneuvered by their coordination. Panther crews cursed their Fug-5s, pounding the radios in frustration, while American crews calmly spoke through headsets that never failed them. The war was slipping away, and in their quiet moments, German commanders knew why. The future of warfare had spoken, and it spoke with an American voice. As the war in Europe drew to a close in 1945, German cities lay in ruins, and the once proud Wehrmacht was in retreat. American Shermans rolled through shattered towns and open plains, their tracks grinding across the very heartland of the Reich. Looking back, it's easy to see the Sherman only in terms of steel, the armor that too often proved thin, the gun that sometimes struggled against panthers and tigers. But ask the men who fought in them, and they'll tell you the real weapon of the Sherman wasn't its cannon. It was the radio. That little metal box, the SCR-508, gave American tankers something no amount of armor plate could: connection. It turned isolation into unity. It turned chaos into coordination. The Germans often outgunned the Shermans, but they rarely outmaneuvered them. Why? Because the Shermans weren't fighting alone. Every tank was a commander. Every platoon was a conversation. Every battlefield was alive with American voices, calm and clear, even in the storm of battle. It wasn't just technology, it was philosophy. The Germans clung to rigid hierarchy, where only leaders could speak. The Americans embraced flexibility, where every man, every tank, could share what he saw. That difference, rigid chains versus living networks, was decisive. To the crews, the radios were lifelines. Many veterans remembered not the roar of engines, but the voices that carried them through. A Sherman gunner recalled, "When everything was falling apart, it was that voice in your ear that steadied you. You knew someone had your back." To the infantry, the addition of the tank telephone turned frustration into partnership. Suddenly, they weren't screaming at machines that couldn't hear them. They were guiding their steel partners step by step, hedge by hedge, street by street. The radio wasn't just a device. It was trust, made real in sound waves. The war ended, but the lesson endured. Modern armies would never again send tanks into battle without full communication. Radios became as essential as engines and guns. In many ways, the Sherman's FM sets were the ancestors of the digital networks that guide today's soldiers and drones. What began as Edwin Armstrong's invention in the 1930s became the nervous system of the modern battlefield. And the philosophy that came with it, that everyone must be connected, that communication is as vital as firepower, remains true to this day. For the Germans, it was a bitter irony. They had pioneered the use of radios in armored warfare, only to be overtaken by the very idea they had unleashed. The masters of blitzkrieg became victims of silence, while the Americans perfected the art of coordination. One German officer, captured late in the war, summed it up with quiet resignation. "Your tanks were not better than ours, but your tanks spoke. Ours were mute. That is why we lost." History often remembers the flashy weapons, the Tiger's massive gun, the P-51 Mustang's speed, the atomic bomb's terrible power. But sometimes, the most decisive weapons are the ones no one can see. For the Sherman, that weapon was invisible. It was a clear voice carried on radio waves, cutting through smoke and fire, binding men together when they might otherwise have been alone. It was the voice that turned defeats into resilience at Kasserine. It was the voice that guided men up the beaches of Normandy. It was the voice that smashed open France in Operation Cobra, and it was the voice that carried American tanks into the heart of Germany. The story of the Sherman's radio is more than a tale of technology. It is a reminder of what wins wars. Not just bravery, not just steel, but the ability to connect, to adapt, to work as one. In the end, that was America's greatest strength. Not just the tanks, not just the ships, not just the planes, but the way all of it could be tied together into one unstoppable force. And that lesson still speaks across the decades. So when we think of the Sherman today, notorious for its flaws, remembered for its bravery, we should remember too the secret it carried inside, the invisible gift of connection. Because in World War II, the greatest battles were not only fought with guns and armor. They were fought with voices, voices that cut through static and fear, voices that gave men courage, voices that turned the tide of history. And in that sense, the Sherman's most powerful weapon was never its cannon. It was the radio. And now, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think? Was the Sherman's radio the most underrated weapon of World War II? Or do you believe something else made the real difference? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all, and your perspective adds so much to these stories. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden side of history, give this video a like. It helps us bring more untold stories to life. And don't forget to subscribe, because we have so many more tales coming. Stories of courage, surprise, and the little details that changed the course of the war. So stay tuned, because the next story is one you won't want to miss.